So when I came to the New York Botanical Garden in 1980 as a beginning PhD student, I was making around the rounds, meeting the professors and the curators and trying to decide on a project. And so I was found one called Scott Mori. He was a young curator who had not yet had graduate students yet, and I thought he'd be a great curator to help me mentor my PhD thesis. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to work in the tropics, and he was a superb tropical botanist. So I go into his office, meeting for the first time, sitting around, looking around his office, and I noticed all this pottery on the shelves in his office. And I thought, well, I studied some archaeology back earlier in my life. I thought I'd try to impress him with some observations. I said, Dr. Moore, do you collect these pots in South America with the Indians down there? And he kind of, Brian, these are the fruits of trees in the Brazil nut family that we're going to study when you go with me to Brazil next month. And this is what they look like. I think I can be excused for thinking that maybe I was looking at a pot. This is a monkey pot. Lethethes pisonis is the name of the plant. And it's in the Lethethidaceae. And it's called a monkey pot. We'll see pictures of it in the slides I'm going to show you, because the seeds that are inside are in there. They stuck in there when the top cap pops off. The seeds are in there, and monkeys stick their hands in there to try to get the seeds out. But guess what? They get their hands stuck because they got their hands full of seeds. They're greedy. And so people call it the monkey pot because they're just stuck. Mm-hmm. The seeds are delicious, by the way. They taste more delicious than Brazil nuts, but they can't be commercialized because the monkeys get to them before people. Anyway, so that was my introduction and my major humiliation in front of the man that was to then mentor my career. And we went on to Brazil. He was forgiving. I was substantially subdued, and went to Brazil and to Bahia. The first place I got to go before you show the slides was to one of the most highly endangered ecosystems in the New World tropics, the so-called Atlantic coastal forest of Brazil, the Mata Atlântica.
Actually, I photographed there, and some of my images were published in the New York Times with some of those monkeys.
Okay, there you go. Well, that Mata Atlântica was where I was privileged to go. We went there for a couple of months in 1981 to study the forest. We had a grant from the World Wildlife Fund, which, small world story, Tom Lovejoy was vice president for science at World Wildlife then. We got the grant, went to Bahia, Brazil, did the study. I saw Brazil nut trees up close and personal, saw their pollinators, and said, this is so cool. It worked out well. I collected plants with Dr. Mori. We came back. We published our book through the New York Botanical Garden. And then it worked out so well, he invited me to go to French Guiana, where we had another grant to study the Brazil nut family over a period of, in my case, months, like 4 or 5 months. I was still a graduate student, and he for the rest of his career. And it was like the most amazing experience. It was where I became, in 1982, I think, a competent enough tropical botanist. So I want to show you a few slides about that experience that I had with pollination study in the Brazil nut family. So we begin with here, Dr. Gillian Prance, who I mentioned with his book on that glorious forest, was one of my advisors as well. And here they are. I took this picture sitting under a tree on the floor of the French Guianan forest near La Fumée Mountain near the town of Saúl. Now, French Guiana is an overseas province of France. So when people say, have you ever been to France? Yeah, I spent 4 or 5 months in France. French Guiana. But it's completely French. And there's Dr. Mori on the right, and they're discussing a Brazil nut fruit. So I had an amazing opportunity there. I was there for 1982, as I said. If we can go to the next slide, I will show you some pictures that Dr. Mori put together. Before I get to that, these are some pictures of, from top left, the village of Saúl, tiny little village. There's no road there. You have to fly in on a small airplane. Air Guiane is the only way in. It's Dr. Mori pressing a plant in the field between newspaper. He and I drying plants over the dryers in our on our dryers, and then the Carbet in the forest on top of the mountain where we spent nights with the jaguars collecting plants for our inventory. The next slide, I'm going to go through. This shows the trail system in the publication. I'm going to show you at the end. Don't even try to look at the details here. The left is the name of the trails, the La Fumée Trail, and the straight lines on that diagram to the left are a transect, a line transect we did to sample quantitatively not only the trees in the Brazil nut family, but of the forest itself, because we were trying to characterize the forest. Then along each branch of the trail on the right, you can see this is Antan Est. Each number represents a Brazil nut tree in that family that we marked with a permanent marker and collected, so it could be there for a future study and our own study of the pollination. If you just click through the next couple of slides, Kike, other sections of the trail, just to show you the numbers of trees, the hundreds of trees that we marked with tags, so we could go back. And another one, more trail. This is why you do this in your 30s. You asked what you do in your 30s? This is it. The next slide. Right, so this is just to sum up what we did. I was there, like I said, for 4 or 5 months. Dr. Mori and other colleagues. This is a real team effort. You know, this is not me. This is me being part of a big effort. But we were able to document some really amazing things. Hey, there could be a Strange Flowers Volume 2, Kike, on the Brazil nut plants. Look at these guys.
Give me ideas.
So the bumblebee pollinated syndrome is shown by this Gustavia hexapetala, which has kind of actinomorphic flowers is the technical term, but they're kind of open and flat. And bees like bumblebees come in and stumble around and they eat the pollen. These don't produce nectar. They're eating the pollen. That's the reward. And they pollinate other flowers that way. And then even bats get in on it. So this Lethusis ptoii at night, that was one of the real cool studies. We had mist nets up in the trees. And this was photographed by a very famous bat photographer called Merlin Tuttle. Anyone who knows about bats in the new tropics will know that name. He worked with us. Lethusis ptoii, white flower, typical syndrome of night pollinated plants. Then let's see, the Trigona bee pollinated in this Corythophora, on this red flower. And then on the right bottom is the Euglossian bee. We heard Euglossian bees and orchids. Well, these orchid bees get involved with Brazil nut plants too. And they're used as a pollinate in these plants as well. So we were able to document in detail the visitors and the pollinators that came to these plants in the next slide over that time. So that was my introduction. You can, next slide, please, Kike. Yeah, so this was the publication, also available through the New York Botanical Garden shop, if you want to see the technical details of it. But I show a herbarium specimen. This is actually a new species of Eschweileria that Scott Mori and I found. And Scott described it as new to science from our study down there. A handful of species, maybe half a dozen of new species in that family, came out of this study. And so this is the herbarium voucher, which is just the traditional way that botanists collect plants and preserve them and mount them for perpetuity in herbaria. Herbaria, which New York has an extremely large one of, is simply a fancy name for a museum of plants. So it's a museum of plants. So we have that in New York Botanical Garden. And you can go on our website and get behind the scenes information about it. So Scott Mori, who sadly passed away 2 years ago, and I really wanted to give a shout out to him and thank him retrospectively, as I did when he was alive, for all he did for me and dozens of students and other colleagues in the study of not only this plant, but neotropical plants generally. And several years ago, he put together a slideshow, which if we can put up the next slide, Kike, you can have, there's a link at the bottom of it, which if you go on and click to it, you can click through all of his slides. And it's going to show you a sampling of them so you can see. It's really a lecture that he put together, bees and Brazil nuts trees. I said bats, bees, and Brazil nut trees is what the title of the slide will say. And it's very cool, and it walks you through it in detail. And let's just go
Actually,
through a few
Brian,
slides.
sorry that I interrupt. What I will
Yeah,
do,
yeah,
all these links that you're referring to on this interview, I will put them below on comments so
yeah.
people can go and check your books directly to the New York Botanical Gardens or review this
Yeah.
presentation. So that will make it easier for everyone in the future.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. That'd be very helpful. So this is a great resource for plants, not just pollination, but the dispersal of these plants. He goes into that, as well as the economic value. So next slide. Um, so he showed talking about economic value. So in a can of mixed nuts, the biggest nut in there is a Brazil nut, which of course is not really a nut; it's a seed. But this is what botanists also get annoyed by when they call people. It should be Brazil seed. Here's a guy in Brazil splitting it open with a machete to shake out the nuts, and then shows the cannonball tree and so on. Next slide. The biggest tree in this picture is a Brazil nut tree. This is along one of the Brazilian rivers, probably the Rio Negro. And your chirpy palms are there. Next slide. Um, the distribution of the neotropical members, the New World tropical members of this family, shows how extensive it is. It's not in dry areas and it's not in the mountains, but it's very widely distributed and very important ecologically. The next picture. And here are the two flower types. He goes into the pollination biology, and just to summarize by these two, it has the flowers like the Gustavia that are actinomorphic. I showed bee pollinated, like bumblebees on the left-hand side. And the more advanced kinds have more tightly coiled uh, zygomorphic flowers is the technical term, like this lettuces and others such as Eschweileri and Corythophora and Casuarina. Not Casuarina, Cariniana, excuse me. Next slide. Yeah, he talks about the kind it's really a lecture, so this kind of pollinator syndromes, rewards, pollen or nectar, or in the case of Euglossian bees, aroma, right? Because as we mentioned, so you kind of have like three kind of conditions here. Next. And he goes into the details, which you can see when you go on there about the structure of the flower, and you see how the relationship of the structure relates to the functionality in relation to the pollinators. Highly specialized, and the more advanced forms have a more tightly evolved link with a certain kind of pollinator that has a bee with a tongue so long that it can go, next slide, into a zygomorphic flower and around. This has to go in and around to get to the nectar in the very, very tip of it. And guess what? When it gets down in there, it does the pollination deed too, because it picks up pollen from these anthers on this andrecium, which is what the specialized structure is called with the stamens. So you could spend a whole lifetime, and Scott Moore, did, and others of his students have spent an entire lifetime studying this. And the beat goes on. There are students at universities and museums and gardens in South America, Central America, North America, and around the world, really studying this plant. If you're interested, I suggest you go to the link website. You can check it out in your leisure. Yeah, see if there's another one there. See if there's another slide. Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, this was the bat pollinator one. I wanted to make sure because the Strange Flowers book didn't have any bat pollinated. I want to make sure you know that's cool too. And hey, you could do one, Kike, on mammals because you got that mouse in Costa Rica.
Yes.
Doing the Blakea, you got bats. You could do a whole thing on mammals.
Actually, when we finish the interview, I'm going to ask you because I'm about to finish a book on deforestation.
Yeah.
That it's in the making, but I
Yeah.
was just thinking about potential sequels of Strange Flowers. So maybe I'll go ahead and produce a new one. You want me to show you the next slide?
Yeah, one more. Let's see if it's got one more. Oh, yeah. So another thing I want you to have a link to, this is a great video, which we don't have time to show, but it's by a colleague of Dr. Scott Mori, who I mentioned, and mine by whose name is Javier. Uh, sorry, Cornejo, Javier Cornejo, and he was the research associate at the New York Botanical Garden. He's Ecuadorian, a wonderful botanist. You can show the next slide. It shows his picture. Yeah, Cornejo, there he is. Javier. He's now in Guayaquil, at the herbarium in Guayaquil. He's an amazing scientist, collector of plants in Ecuador, and he co-produced this YouTube video with Scott Mori about the plants in this family that he's found in the country of Ecuador. He was at the New York Botanical Garden. I met him, this was maybe 12, 15 years ago now. And he stuck with it. And he's specialist in another family as well, the caper family. But anyway, if you go on this, you'll get a very beautifully produced video with a great soundtrack of showing the beauty and the diversity. It comes to the point circling back, Kike, we talked about, you got to get to love these plants, and you'll love them by the beauty of them. And you can just see the structures and see the complex size of the leaves and the fruits and the flowers. And how can you not love them?